Every April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and it is a month to really highlight sexual violence and how prevalent it is in our society and in our communities, and what we can do to prevent it, to address it. Sexual assault, sexual violence are huge, and it happens like everywhere, we may have this idea that it'll never happen to me, it's not in my community, but it is everywhere. Roughly 325,566 people are sexually assaulted every year in the United States. On top of that, every 73 seconds, someone in the United States is raped. It is prevalent, and we want to do something about it. My name is Courtney. I am a youth advocate as well as the education coordinator for the Dove Center.
My name is Brianna. I am the education manager at the Dove Center, and I've been working as a victims advocate for about 3 years.
I'm Elizabeth Bloom. I'm the Rape and Sexual Assault Recovery Services Manager at Dove Center.
My name is Brittany. I am the clinical supervisor as well as a child and family therapist with Dove Center. I think we'll see a common theme in many of the rape and sexual assault myths that will be covered today. But I just think it's really important to point out that these myths have the common theme of allowing people to think that they're safer and that they're able to protect themselves, and therefore survivors are the ones to blame for somebody else's behavior. Sexual assault is a crime. The responsibility only lies within the perpetrator. And culturally, especially women have been socialized to take accountability for someone else's behavior, particularly men's. But the only person in charge of one's actions is the person committing the action.
The first one that we'll talk about is rape only happens to those who ask for it.
Nobody asks to be abused. Nobody asks to be injured or humiliated. No one can cause somebody to commit a crime against them. Nobody asked to be raped.
That phrase, asking for it, kind of ties into this conversation about what somebody was wearing, or whether they were drinking, or how flirty they were being at a party. And those behaviors are used to justify raping somebody or sexually assaulting somebody because they were asking for it, because they were dressed in a certain way. But you're right, Brittany, that no one is asking for it. They don't deserve it, no matter what they were wearing or if they were drinking or any of that.
Sexual assault really has very little to do with how a victim is behaving socially or dressing. It has far more to do with the aggressor, the perpetrator, making a choice, making a decision to target someone, to take advantage of that person, to make choices about their body that they have no business, no right making. It's a crime. It's a felony.
I think that ties really well into another myth, that rape only happens to bad girls or bad people, and that it's only committed by bad people. Rape only happening to women and only being committed by men.
I'm just thinking about the very many different kinds of people I've advocated for over the years. I respond to the hospital as a first responder to the hospital for people going through rape kit exams, and there's not one type of person who is assaulted or raped. It's men, it's children, it's adolescents, it's elderly, it's middle-aged, it's every gender experiences this, every demographic type, every kind of person. To think that it only happens to women who dress a certain way or who act a certain way is ridiculous. I've heard hundreds now of stories, and they are all different situations, and no two are alike, no two are the same. And the actions taken prior to were all different, or it's just not as pigeonholed. It's not as simple. It's not as easy as a lot of people would like to think, to just be able to say, oh yeah, like if I don't do this X, Y, and Z, then it will never happen to me. Or if, as long as I teach my kids to never do X, Y, and Z, it'll never happen to them. Well, it doesn't work that way.
Just that belief that if I do X, Y, Z, or if I teach my kids X, Y, Z, then they won't be raped, they won't be assaulted, is that people are still assaulted, people are still raped. And then having that mentality as part of our cultural norm is that if they were assaulted after doing all those things, then now it's their fault.
That X, Y, and Z, those may be risk reduction strategies. That's not prevention. The person who can prevent a rape or a sexual assault is the perpetrator. Most of the risk reduction strategies that are out there are aimed at keeping you safe from strangers assaulting you. When the reality is, people know they're perpetrators. They have a relationship with their perpetrators. The majority of sexual assaults are perpetrated by someone the victim knows and trusts. So, never going out at night, never go, be where a stranger could grab you, putting your keys between your fingers, and do all of these many things. The majority of sexual assaults occur in your own home, where you're supposed to be safe. That's going back and forth. That is like gaslighting, okay, ultimately, to make us feel crazy, because everything you say we have to do won't necessarily keep us safe from the actual perpetrators, who are people that we know and people that we would trust and allow into our home, or that we would trust enough to go to their home, or where the assaults actually occur. It's not in a dark alley behind a building or a dumpster. That's not happening very often. Does it ever happen? Sure, but not as much as we have blown it up to be. Stranger danger, stranger danger. It's Uncle Joe. It's your coach. It's your teacher. It's the person you trust. It's, a neighbor. It's grandpa. It's grandma. It could be Aunt Tilly. The reality is I'm seeing lots of people who are victimized by people they love, or at least associate with. They're considered friends or acquaintances, and they trusted. There's many reasons why people don't report sexual assault.
I want to kind of bring all of those things together, that a lot of people aren't reporting. This only happens to women. It's only perpetrated by men. Like, they all kind of tie together, this idea that it's a women's issue. So if you're anything but a woman, you're not going to be as believed, and women already aren't really believed, right? That if anybody other than a man was the perpetrator, that you aren't going to be believed. Is such a huge barrier to reporting. We see that in reporting statistics a lot, that we're only getting a certain demographic of people reporting, and that plays a lot into gender stereotypes and the roles of our society. But this can happen to anybody, and it can be perpetrated by anybody, and that's not to scare you, but it's just for you to know that there's help for everyone. And whatever the circumstances, assault is assault, violence is violence, harassment is harassment. And there are a lot of people that maybe they don't want to report because they would be outed, for being trans or for being queer, or people who don't want to report because it would emasculate them. But even if you choose not to report, it's still harmful, and it's still this really awful thing that happened to you. And I think that that's something we should address, is why is it only one type of person, and why is no one being believed? Why is it the victim's fault? Why are we finding any excuse we can to blame the survivor rather than hold the perpetrator accountable? Sexual assault is considered the least reported, the most underreported violent crime there is. And we gotta take the blame. It's because in a culture of rape in which we live, clearly,
The victim blaming is just demoralizing and crippling and holds people back, holds people from going forward and trying to hold the perpetrator accountable. And they're going to get a lot of pushback when they do report. There's this crazy notion or myth out there that there's a lot of false reporting. The rates of false reporting is the exact same as for any other crime, burglary or anything like that. You know, depending on the study you look at, it could be 2 to 8%. That means 92 to 98% of the time, it wasn't a false report. And then you have to look at that stat also, because with a little magnifying glass, because, you know, people will report, and then after receiving threats from family, from the friends of the perpetrator or the perpetrator, and retaliation and all kinds of things, blackmail, you know, threats, all kinds of stuff happens. And so they will say, okay, I'm not up to this, I can't. So they will go back and say, I want to take back my report. Well, in some jurisdictions, that's called a false report. Was it a false report? No, it happened. It's just the person is being persecuted and victimized further to the point where they can't tolerate it. So they will recant or take their story back. That doesn't mean it was a false report. Very few of these cases ever make it to the court system. And you have to know, as a survivor, you have to know that just because it couldn't be proved beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law does not mean it didn't happen. It never means that. Your experience is valid regardless of whether it can be proven in a court of law. That's why we all have to start by believing victims and survivors when they have the incredible courage and ability to come forward and disclose something like this, which is what it takes, incredible courage. We got to start with believing. Studies have shown that if someone discloses to someone, the first person who responds, if they are responding with victim blaming, with this crazy nonsense that we have in our society that wants to blame the victim of a crime rather than the perpetrator, that will keep a survivor from going further and seeking sources for help, for healing, counseling, any resources they need. And that's a violation. When we victim blame, we are violating that person over again, possibly with an impact to affect them for the rest of their life. Check your own biases at the door, or just become aware of your own biases and understand and listen to conversations like this when we call something that you may believe, that you might really think is true. We're calling it a myth. Think about it. Listen and think and stop before your knee-jerk reaction is to blame a victim of a crime for the crime that was perpetrated against them. If you blame somebody who gets robbed for having stuff worth stealing, that's ludicrous. Blaming victims of sexual assault is ludicrous. The majority of people who experience sexual assault never report. And that's very clear. 8 to 9 out of 10 people won't report.
What does that say for our statistics on the topic? I mean, our statistics are already pretty alarming.
Skewed.
Yeah, but they are skewed, but they're not skewed in a good where we've got this snapshot of the problem, but yeah, exactly. The problem is that much bigger than what we are only seeing the tip of the iceberg here.
It's a lot of people experiencing sexual abuse or sexual assault as minors, as children. Do children have words for it? Can they really weigh out the consequences of reporting or telling? Do they even know what happened? Do they have the words? No. Most of the time, no. Especially if we're not educating our children and talking to them about consent, about what that means, that they have the right to decide about their bodies. That's a huge reason right there why so much of this goes unreported.
in regard to, educating kids about consent and body safety is, it doesn't have to be this this big talk that most parents envision, like we're going to sit down and talk about the birds and the bees. It doesn't have to look like that. It can start as early as infancy, and just teaching the child that there's such thing as safe touch, and that they get to decide what happens to their bodies. If you don't want to kiss Aunt Jane, you don't have to give her a kiss. You don't want to hug Uncle Fred, that's okay. That's, your body is your body. Sometimes a parent can teach their kid as much as possible, and a kid will still be sexually abused. And it's not the child's fault, definitely not the child's fault, but it's also not the parent's fault. Just because somebody's child is abused doesn't mean that the parent was a bad parent or that they didn't do their job to protect their child. Child sexual abuse flies under the radar pretty often, and the implications are even more long-lasting for child sexual assault victims. Child victims are 4 times as likely to develop drug abuse problems. They're 4 times as likely to experience PTSD as adults, as well as in childhood. They're seeing and experiencing their world with a different pair of glasses. They're looking at the world with these red-colored glasses all the time, and that's how they're interpreting their experiences. That's how they're reacting to relational traumas, or even just little mini arguments. You might see a child just fly off the handle. Let's look deeper and see what's really causing that to happen.
I want to bring up this idea that if you didn't want it, you should have fought back. And this is a question that I hear a lot, and that doesn't even begin to address, like, if it was a child or an elderly person, like, they don't have the ability to fight it off, or sometimes even the knowledge that they need to fight it off, that this isn't an okay thing happening. And then you get into, like, the details of this being asked to an adult, and that's so invalidating, whether you're a child or an adult or an elderly person who has been sexually assaulted, and you're asked, like, why didn't you fight back? There's something called fight, flight, freeze. And so for some people, when they're in a dangerous situation, yeah, they do fight back, but a lot of people will try to get away. That's not always an option. And even more people in this situation, they just freeze up.
I want it to be very clear that we don't get to choose our response in a traumatic situation. It's an automatic response. Your brain goes into survival mode, and it's going to do whatever it can to keep you alive. Mm-hmm. And a situation as traumatizing as a sexual assault or rape, it's a threat. You don't know what this person is capable or likely to do because you're feeling you are powerless in the situation. And people who have experienced powerlessness in their younger years, when they were children, whether they were sexually abused or another form of being powerless completely, it's terrifying. And at that time, if you tried to fight and the person was too big to fight, if you tried to flee, run away, flight response, and they were too fast because you were a kid and they were bigger. Now, 10 years, 15 years later, you're in this situation where you are powerless and someone is making choices for you and you can't. Your brain is going to say, it's going to already go. Flight doesn't work. Fight doesn't work. Freeze, that's our option here. That's why so many people respond to a sexual assault with that freeze response. It's just there. The brain's already gone, no, check. Okay, yeah, play dead. This is the response that's gonna get the most traction. If you play dead, he won't kill you. Pretty scary thought, but that's what your brain is calculating.
If you've ever seen like a possum play dead, to try and get the predator away, it's a very similar concept, and that doesn't mean that you wanted it to happen. It doesn't mean that you were consenting. Absolutely not. Just because you don't fight back doesn't mean that you wanted that assault to happen, and it doesn't mean that you were okay with it.
I want to take it one step further. When somebody is being sexually assaulted, when someone's being raped, sometimes our bodies respond to sexual touch in ways that might inform the perpetrator that it's being enjoyed. And that's just how the human body functions. It does not mean that there's been consent just because our body is responding in a certain way.
If someone seems aroused, but they say no, that's a no. You cannot infer consent based on bodily functions. But also, yes doesn't always mean yes. And I love the phrase like yes means yes, and that is so important. But you have to take into account coercion, bribery, threats, manipulation. If you are so afraid to say no that you feel you have to say yes, it's not consent. And you might feel that guilt inside of, well, I did say yes, like I did verbally say yes, but were you told that you would do this if you loved them? Were you told that if you don't, someone would be hurt? Right? That completely voids consent. So no means no, despite bodily functions, and yes means yes, but not in the case of coercion or bribery or threats or manipulation, etc. Consent is a conversation too. This is also something that needs to be talked about. It's not just a one-time answer at the beginning of sexual intercourse. So if you say yes and you are actively having sex and you decide you don't want to anymore, you can say no. And the other person needs to stop. And it doesn't matter how inconvenient it is for them or how frustrating it might be. That is your right as a human to say no and to have that respected and not used against you. A yes one time doesn't mean a yes every time. If you consent to something now, that does not mean that you are consenting to it later. There's this huge myth that interpersonal relationship rape doesn't exist, that once you become in an intimate relationship with someone, once you're married, once you have been in a relationship for a long time, that you can't be like raped anymore, that you somehow owe them sex. But that is not the case. And consent your conversations around consent might change as your relationship grows, but consent is still needed in every case.
Marital rape is against the law in all 50 states. I'll just throw that out.
That leads into this question that we got on our Facebook that I'd really love for Brittany to address on if memory is foggy or fragmented, it didn't happen.
It's actually quite common for a survivor of sexual assault or really any other trauma to report fragmented memory of the experience. Our memory networks in our brain are really complex. So the way our brains encode our memories, especially of traumatic events, they're different than our everyday memories. A lot of times when people think of our memories, we think more of like explicit memory or cognitive memories. And those are memories that are prefrontal cortex processes and encodes as more of a chronological and coherent story. During traumatic events, that goes offline. Our limbic system takes control and our bodies are flooded with stress hormones and sensory input that is so overwhelming that our brain can't even begin to process what's happening. Then instead, what our brain focuses on is how to survive in the here and now. At the expense of that chronological story, what can I do to not die? What can I do to function? This causes a diminished ability to recall and make sense of what we're experiencing.
Another myth that it has to be intercourse in order for it to be sexual assault.
In the state of Utah, these aren't federal definitions, they're not other states' definitions, but rape is considered intercourse without consent. There are other crimes listed on the Utah Code that cover other kinds of penetration and other acts like that that are non-consensual. But sexual assault can be touching someone's genitals, a woman's breasts. This is if it's non-consensual, that is a sexual assault. It doesn't have to be penetration to be sexual assault.
In a legal context, like it can be difficult for proof. And so if something happens to you that isn't necessarily defined under law or followed through in a reporting manner, that also doesn't invalidate the pain that you're going through. And it can be really hard to navigate this idea that the perpetrator walks free or isn't serve justice, but your idea of justice may not be necessarily a legal one, and pain is pain. I said it before and I'll say it again, like what happens to you is harmful. What happened to you was awful, and I'm sorry that it happened, and I believe you. And I hope that you can find some validation and healing.
I think a lot of people, when they envision justice, they envision watching their perpetrator get taken off to jail. It's a rarity when that actually happens. It's a rarity for a perpetrator to get convicted. So how can a survivor get justice? Well, that justice can happen in their healing. That justice can happen in doing the trauma work. It can happen in talking about the problem. I've seen so many survivors go through a lengthy healing process, but come out feeling like they can conquer the world and that they can be a voice for those who don't have a voice, just like they didn't have one at one point in time. You don't have to get a conviction to heal from a sexual assault. You don't have to watch your perpetrator get handcuffed and sentenced to jail or to prison to heal and to have justice. You can find that on your own. And that's, in the midst of it, is really powerful. That's one way you get to take your power back.
That if the perpetrator is well liked, it's common that people won't believe the survivor.
Thought that, oh, he doesn't look like a rapist. Oh, he couldn't be a rapist. He's such a sweet guy. He's such a nice person. Or she's just a wonderful human being. Couldn't possibly have sexually abused that child. We can't tell what a rapist looks like. Okay, throw that bias right out. That's nonsense. That's a myth. Rapists look like everybody else. They look like your Aunt Joan and your Grandpa Joe and your, next door neighbor Bill and your, sister Edith. We can't tell. And it pains me so much when I'm working with a survivor who blames themselves because they bought into this rape culture that, it's always the victim's fault. And they say, I should have known. I should have known. Why didn't I know? And they second guess themselves. And when they go to bed at night, they close their eyes and that's all they relive it. And they think, oh, I should have done this or that, or said this or done that, or if only I had, if only. And it is so painful because if we could just get rid of this, overcome this, push this victim blaming culture aside, to help people understand that you're not a mind reader. We're not mind readers. We don't know what's in the heart of someone else. All of us have three personas. Our public persona that everybody sees and that most of us buy and believe is that's who that person is. We see them in public. We see, whatever, we read them about them or whatever. But then we also, all of us have a second persona, which is our private persona, which only a few people ever will see. Maybe our closest loved ones or closest friends. Those are the people that we show a little more to. So we have a public persona, a private persona, and a secret persona, all of us. And the secret persona is one that you will never see in most people. We will never be able to see that in them. And that's the persona that would commit a crime of power control, take over someone's right to choose. That's not going to be in their public persona or even their private persona, most likely. It's going to be that secret persona. And we can't read that. We can't see that in others.
And that got me thinking about the way, the aspect of our culture, of rape culture, where when we hear about a sexual assault that happened on a college campus or a rape that happened in our community, and we as a society jump to, oh, that poor young man that, now because that person reported this rape, now he's going to be in facing all these charges, and that poor young man and that his poor future that's just damaged by this. Instead of that concern for the survivor, for the individual that was assaulted, that was harmed, that was raped, we focus so much on just the wrong side of the story. One of the biggest myths about sexual assault, about rape culture, is the myth that boys will be boys, that sexual violence, that it's an act of passion or an uncontrollable sexual urge, and that's why it happens.
I think what it comes down to is we just really need to make it clear to perpetrators or potential perpetrators that there are consequences for behavior. And every time we say boys will be boys, whether we're talking about sexual assault or we're talking about, Johnny pushed Sally on the playground, we are putting the responsibility of the abusive behavior, of the unacceptable behavior, on the receiver or the victim or the survivor of that behavior. And that's not okay. We need to quit teaching our boys that the girls are to blame for their behavior and their feelings. And we need to quit teaching our girls that they're responsible for men's behavior and that they're responsible for all the people around them and that they're powerless, because they're not. And when we teach our girls that they're responsible for everybody else's behavior and their own, we're taking away that power.
Giving them that power, boys will be boys, which really plays into this idea of like it was an act of passion.
Mm-hmm.
This is just something that boys do. Like they don't have any control over themselves. Like they really, really wanted it. They didn't know what they were doing. Like absolutely, the perpetrator knows what they're doing. It's not a new concept that rape and sexual assault isn't okay. It's always been not okay, but we continue to make excuses and victim blame. It's a power and control thing. It's to hold that power over someone else and to get away with it and to feel like you got something you wanted. You took that from someone else, and it's a choice that they're making. Like you are responsible for your actions, and we all are, and we all have control over our actions. And no amount of passion should be leading you into harmful behavior. No amount of passion should be convincing you that it is okay to hurt someone else.
And if we want to teach people that rape and sexual assault is about passion and uncontrollable urges, what are we teaching children who are sexually abused by adults? We're telling the child that it's their responsibility for what's happening and that it's supposed to happen. And then what happens? Often the child goes on and gets re-victimized or tries to take power back and becomes a perpetrator themselves. And then we see the cycle continue. And all of it can start with a little phrase of boys will be boys. And what were you wearing? 100% of the clients on my caseload have experienced a sexual trauma. A survivor doesn't know, like, how do I begin to heal? Because the whole thing is complex and overwhelming and intense. And I just want to go lay in the corner and cry. Or for a lot of survivors, I just want to die in this pain. It's a really tragic thing to see, but it's also so beautiful to see people heal. It's really an incredible experience. And I feel incredibly blessed by being invited and allowed on journeys with these survivors. Because as hard as the job can be sometimes, it's just beautiful. Watching the human psyche heal, humanizing someone.
Being able to heal through everything is such an empowering thing, and it really just fights back against the victim blaming that's so prevalent in our society. But there's more that can be done. As a community, we need to be fighting, rape culture and victim blaming, and we all have things that we need to continue learning and growing from. And it's not a one-person thing, right? As much as we here are aware of victim blaming and of rape culture, we still have growing to do. And everybody should be doing that together, because it is going to take the whole community to fight these myths and these concepts. We all play into them, and we're all reiterating them every single day. And really, we just need to start fighting back and calling things out and saying, like, no, that's not true, right? Why does it matter what she was wearing? Why are we talking about the survivor and not the perpetrator? Why are we asking why she was drinking? You know, we can change the conversation. We can change the narrative into something like believing. By starting by believing, if you know, are told or about a sexual assault by someone, when you start by believing, when you sit down and tell them that I believe you and I'm sorry about what happened to you, those questions just don't come into play anymore, right? When you are focusing on them and their healing and their pain, it's no longer about what they were wearing. It's no longer about the context around the sexual assault, right? Or what they did to deserve it. Because you're humanizing the person and you're seeing them as an individual that's had a painful experience. And you're sitting down and you're saying, thank you for telling me. Let's talk about this. Let's find help. And I think that a lot of times we do have that mindset of it's never going to happen to me. It's never going to happen to anybody I know. But I guarantee you that every single person knows someone who has experienced a rape or sexual assault. Every single person. And so when you are victim blaming, it's victim blaming the people that you love and you know as well. So if you can take that mindset of a believing and not only extend it to your friends and family, but extend it to the young woman on the news, extend it to the gay man down the street, extend it to the child and the elderly person, extend it to all those who are surviving, extend it to the women who are coming out about abuse from popular media personas, right? If we can extend that believing and if we can start by validation, we are actively fighting the victim blaming. We are actively fighting the rape culture, and we are building a society where people feel safe.
All of the myths and the misconceptions and the biases that we've been talking about today, these are the things that push sexual assault under the rug, that make this issue continue to be perpetuated in our culture every single day. And I think that it's easier. It's easier to just keep pushing it under the rug. It's easier to, to accept that sexual violence happens out in the world, but not here in our pretty town. And it's easier to hear the statistics of 1 in 3 women in their lifetime or 1 in 7 men than it is to accept that one of the 3 most important women in your life could have this happen to them. It's easier to just decide that it's not a big deal, it's just the locker room banter, than to accept that the conversations that you're having with your friends perpetuate rape culture. It's so much easier to just keep brushing it under the rug because this is a culture that we are all a part of, and that means that we are part of the problem. But I think that accepting that it's something we're a part of is also really, really promising because it means that we can change it by changing our own behaviors, our own attitudes, by questioning our own biases, by changing ourselves. That gives us the power to make a difference and to make a change.
So I encourage everyone to just start by believing. If you are a survivor, know that we're here, and I hope that you can start your healing journey.